Well, thank you very much, Siobhan, for that kind introduction. I'm sure that Siobhan herself needs no introduction to this audience because she is, of course, the voice of Capital Radio. Siobhan, how is it today?
Hello, Siobhan. It's very comfy up here.
Oh, very nice, up in the gods. Now, Siobhan, you've worked with us many times before on tuning in events. You've introduced stars of music on the stage. How are you seeing today in comparison with that?
Well, I have to say, last time around, I was sitting within 2 metres of a member of Take That without a mask. So, it's tough at the top and all that. But no, it's actually really great to be back doing an event in a real theatre today. And we have a great lineup of speakers coming up.
Well, thanks so much, Siobhan. That's really great. Thanks for being with us today. And you're going to be hearing a lot more from Siobhan throughout the morning. So I want to welcome you all to another Tuning In. We're so excited that it's an actual live tuning in event. Well, almost live. We're here in a theatre. We're in the wonderful King's Place in King's Cross. And I don't think that after all our virtual events that we can really wait to get back. So very appropriately, today's theme is Back to Business. Now, I think we all understand that there are many, many reasons to be gloomy if you concentrate on what you see on your social media feeds or indeed the news headlines every day. But the thing that we do know is that we are an incredibly creative, energetic industry, and heaven knows we've overcome bad things in the past. So I think I want to talk a little bit about perspective today. We always think, don't we, every generation thinks this is the only thing that's ever happened like this in the world. So we hear a lot about the word unprecedented. But the fact is, we're not really in an unprecedented times. The world has suffered pandemics before, and guess what? Come out the other side. So today I want to look a little bit at the art of forecasting. So what does it feel like normally when people are actually at the eye of the storm? What do they say about it? And what did history show us about whether they were right or wrong? So a little bit of historical perspective. I obviously want to talk about audio and radio through this current pandemic and how we're going to help ourselves get out of it, come out the recovery on the other side. And mainly today, we're going to be looking at all sorts of future opportunities. So we have a fantastic lineup, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of things before we start. So the art of forecasting. No one ever said it was easy, did they, to be Mystic Meg? But some of you will have seen The Economist recently, which I think is a sort of bellwether for how people are seeing the development of coming out of this pandemic, when they talked about looking at a 90% economy when we move out the other side. Now that means that, in essence, we're not going to get back to 100% of where we were, but we will get back to 90% within the discuss how far that future goes. So that's one way of looking at the economics that we're facing. It's not terrible, but it is definitely going to be tough. But for me, it's very important to keep that in perspective, as I say, from the eye of the storm to looking a bit more long term. Every generation has its own crises, every decade, you might say. In the last 30 years alone, we have had, in the UK, we crashed out of the European exchange rate mechanism in 1992. And for those of us who are old enough to remember, interest rates went to 15% in one day. It looked quite scary at the time. And then, of course, later on, we had the global pandemic, the global financial crash, in 2008. So a slightly different sort of event to deal with. But let's look at what people were saying at the time and what happened subsequently. Look, take the ERM, for instance. So this graph is from something that is considered a Bible inside the Treasury. It's called the Blue Book. It's what the Treasury uses to both forecast what's going to happen, but very usefully for us, for these purposes, they also look back to see how accurate they were in their predictions. So at the beginning of the 1990s, it was fairly obvious there was a lot of trouble brewing about the European exchange rate mechanism, and it looked pretty inevitable that at some stage Britain would not be able to remain part of that system. So the forecasts were, as you see on this graph, the blue and the green lines showed a pretty sharp decline, in fact a double-dip recession as we came up slightly in 1991 and then went back down again. But from top to bottom, from peak to trough, at the time, they thought there was going to be a 4.3% drop in the economy. So that's fairly drastic. Now, if you fast forward to 2011, with all the amazing benefit of hindsight that we got at that stage, you'll see that what actually happened is the yellow line at the top. So yes, there was a dip in the economy, but there was certainly no double dip recession. And then we started recovering as coming out of that. Now, I'm certainly not disparaging economic forecasting. It's just as difficult as every other sort of forecasting. It's just important to remember that sometimes when you read bad news upon bad news upon bad news, that's not the whole picture. And when you're in the eye of the storm, it's a little bit harder to see that. I mean, you can also talk about the financial crisis in 2008, obviously a different sort of crisis from the pandemic. But here's one thing at that time, we're still looking at the ramifications of what actually happened at that time. But I remember very vividly in 2012, there was talk of not a single dip recession, not a double dip recession, but a triple dip recession happening in that year. Now, luckily, that didn't, and we did start on the road to recovery thereafter. Once again, I'm not saying there's no point looking at forecasting. Of course there is. But I think historical perspective always shows you something. And what it's shown us in the past, in these two instances I'm talking about, is that certainly our industry was able to use those times of adversity to actually get ahead and get back on our feet again. So I think that's a little bit about what I want to talk about next. So radio and audio. Radio during this time of pandemic, it really did become the friend in the room, didn't it? You know, when that initial shock in March and April, when actually literally couldn't go out of our houses and meet other people, well, that was when the main attribute of radio really came into its own, because radio is part of a shared experience. And that's the thing that it delivers for us. And that's why it became so important when we actually couldn't go out of the room. So, you know, it's 100 years old, radio. It's amazing to say, but it seems like a medium that's been invented for today's multitasking world. For today, when we like to do 4 different things at the same time, we can either be completely immersed in that experience of listening to the voice on the radio, or it can be company in the background. And it performed many of these tasks during a time when people were actually locked into their houses. And that's one of the reasons why 89% of the population are still tuning into radio every week. It's another, including 82% of that elusive 15 to 24-year-old population also listening once a week. Also, in commercial radio terms, that delivers 36 million adults every week for 13 hours each week. So it's got a fantastic reach, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that today. Time spent with the radio still far exceeds that spent with social media. It doesn't surprise us, but it often takes other people by surprise, so it is definitely worth repeating. And I think this is a particularly interesting side, that time spent with live radio, it continues to dominate all listening. Now, inevitably, we concentrate on the new things, the great podcasts, the amazing streaming opportunities that are out there for us. But actually, live radio continues to be the dominant form of audio. And I think it goes back to what I was saying a little earlier. It delivers a different experience. It answers to a different need state. It actually reminds us that we are part of a bigger whole. And heaven knows, I think we need some reminding of that at present. If you want to know more about that, the Radiocenre's excellent Audio Now report from a few years ago talks about the different need states and why we go to different forms of media to perform different roles in our life. So certainly when the CEO of Spotify, Daniel Ek, talks about streaming overtaking radio, I think he secretly knows that that is never going to happen, because we're just operating in different spheres. But anyway, we've sent him a copy of this just to see if he wants to know more about that one. So another reason for radio's enduring popularity, particularly in this time of fake news and everything else, is that it's an incredibly trusted medium. This is, and of course during the pandemic that was particularly important because we needed to know what was happening from a reliable source. This chart is from the European Commission. It's a survey they do every year about what is the most trusted medium in the continent, and radio has been the most trusted medium for every year in the last 10 years, which I think says something about our enduring popularity. we're going to hear a little bit more about the reports we've done on listening during lockdown, so I won't say much about that other than to say that the stats back up what we've just been saying about radio becoming a particularly important friend in the room during lockdown, that there was a 38% increase in listening among commercial radio listeners. Mark and Camilla will be going into more detail later on, but here is the finding of their latest research. So the top line is that increase in listening has remained more or less consistent. And that's as people start to, unlock lockdown, if you like. So there are these are interesting times ahead for radio and for advertisers considering using radio. There's one thing that this has taught us above anything else is that flexibility is going to be the key to the future. I mean, we've all learned that. We had to learn it straight away in our working lives as we started conducting all our business by Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and we all became expert in doing things that we hadn't really expected to do, certainly not in the near future. But it's one of the reasons why radio became front of mind for advertisers at this point, when it was very difficult to go out and actually make physical ads. The radio answered two important needs for them. The first was that you can change the message very quickly, you can get to market really, really quickly. So here's an ad that we put together just to remind people of the flexibility of radio as a medium.
Announcing a technological breakthrough. A marketing tool so immediate, your message can reach the nation at the speed of sound. Okay, look, it's radio. Yes, radio. And because it's so simple to make, you can write your brilliant ad today, record it in the morning, and be on air by the evening. Oh, and don't worry. You can still sound fancy. See radio differently at radiocentre.org.
So, just to sum up then, I'm always very much a glass half full sort of person. So I think there are many reasons for us to be worried at this current time, but there are also incredible numbers of new opportunities that we can seize, both us as a medium, but also the whole advertising industry, that will help to really kickstart the recovery. And I think we want to be the industry that when in 10 years' time people look back on our performance at this time, think, well, those were the guys who got it right. They really knew what to do.